November 9th, 2016. A 34-year-old youth pastor in suburban Atlanta sits at his kitchen table staring at election results on his laptop. For the first time in his life, he feels a profound disconnection from a word he's used to describe himself since childhood: evangelical. Within 6 months, he'll stop using it entirely. He's not alone. Between 2016 and 2023, over 6 million Americans made the same decision, quietly erasing a label that once defined their spiritual identity. They didn't stop believing in God. They didn't abandon their faith. They simply couldn't bear to be called evangelical anymore. Something unprecedented happened to American Christianity in the last decade, and most people completely missed it. While pundits argued about politics and culture wars raged on cable news, millions of believers were staging a silent exodus from one of the most powerful religious identities in modern history. This isn't just a story about polling numbers or church attendance. This is about the spectacular collapse of a brand that took 400 years to build and less than a decade to destroy. The numbers are staggering. In 2006, according to Pew Research Center, roughly 28% of Americans identified as evangelical or born-again Christians. By 2014, that number held relatively steady at 25.4%. Then something broke. By 2019, it dropped to 23%. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. The decline accelerated. Recent surveys from 2023 show the number may now be closer to 21%. And among Americans under 30, evangelical identification has cratered to just 13%. We're watching the real-time disintegration of a religious identity that once shaped American politics, culture, and moral discourse. But the raw numbers only tell half the story. What makes this collapse so extraordinary is who's leaving. These aren't primarily atheists or agnostics who've lost their faith. Many are deeply committed Christians who still attend church regularly, still read their Bibles, still pray daily, and still hold to traditional evangelical theology. They believe in the virgin birth, the resurrection, the authority of Scripture, and the necessity of being born again. By every theological measure, they are evangelicals. They just refuse to call themselves that anymore. Take Rachel Morrison, a 29-year-old from Nashville who grew up in the Southern Baptist Church. She leads a Bible study with 12 women every Wednesday morning. She volunteers at a pregnancy resource center. She tithes faithfully. Her theology hasn't changed one bit since she was baptized at age 13. But in 2018, she scrubbed the word evangelical from her social media bio and stopped using it in conversation. When asked about her faith, she now says she's a Jesus follower or simply Christian. When pressed about why, her answer is blunt. The word evangelical doesn't mean what it used to mean. Now it means supporting a certain political party, hating certain people, and being angry all the time. That's not who I am. Rachel represents millions. A 2022 study by the Gospel Coalition found that 41% of theologically conservative Christians under 40 actively avoid the evangelical label, even when they agree with evangelical doctrine. Think about that. Nearly half of young believers who hold evangelical views reject the evangelical identity. It's like being a vegetarian who refuses to call themselves a vegetarian because of what people assume about vegetarians. The brand has become toxic to the very people it's supposed to represent. So what happened? How did evangelical go from a badge of honor to a term of embarrassment in less than a generation? To understand the breakdown, we need to understand what evangelical actually meant. The word comes from the Greek euangelion, meaning good news or gospel. Protestantism has used it since the Reformation, but in America, it gained specific definition in the mid-20th century. Historian David Bebbington identified 4 key markers: biblical authority, the centrality of Christ's crucifixion, the necessity of personal conversion, and active missionary work. These theological distinctives separated evangelicals from both liberal Protestants and Catholics. For decades, if you believed these things, you were evangelical. It was a theological category, not a political one. The turning point came gradually, then suddenly. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, evangelical leaders like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson forged an alliance between conservative Christianity and Republican politics. The Moral Majority and Christian Coalition made evangelicalism synonymous with specific policy positions: opposition to abortion, traditional marriage, school prayer, and smaller government. But here's the crucial detail most people miss. Even during the height of the religious right, polling showed that rank-and-file evangelicals held diverse political views. In 1984, Ronald Reagan won 78% of white evangelical votes, but that meant 22% voted for someone else. Evangelicalism was becoming politicized, but it wasn't yet entirely consumed by politics. The transformation accelerated in the 2000s. The Iraq War, the financial crisis, and the culture's rapid shift on LGBTQ issues created a siege mentality among evangelical leaders. Churches that had once focused primarily on evangelism and discipleship began organizing around political resistance. Sermons increasingly featured political themes. Small groups discussed Supreme Court decisions alongside Scripture. The boundary between Sunday morning worship and Tuesday night campaign rallies blurred. Then came 2016 and the dam broke. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig deep into the stories that shape our world. If you found value in this investigation, consider leaving a super thanks to support this kind of in-depth research. And I'm curious, where are you watching from right now, and what's your profession? Drop it in the comments. Let's continue. 81%. That's the number that changed everything. In November 2016, exit polls showed that 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. The number itself shocked political observers, but what made it historically significant was the tension it created. Here was a thrice-married casino owner who bragged about sexual assault receiving overwhelming support from a religious community that claimed to champion family values and personal morality. The contradiction was too glaring to ignore. What happened next is documented in dozens of studies and thousands of interviews. Christians who had faithfully identified as evangelical for their entire lives suddenly found themselves in an impossible position. If they stayed silent, they were complicit with what they saw as hypocrisy. If they spoke up, they were accused of dividing the church or letting political liberalism corrupt their faith. Many chose a third option. They kept their beliefs but abandoned the label. The data reveals the fracture lines. A 2019 Pew study found that among white evangelicals under 30, only 54% approved of Trump, compared to 77% of those over 65. The generational divide was massive. Young evangelicals looked at their parents and grandparents defending behavior that contradicted everything they'd been taught about Christian character, and they experienced cognitive dissonance. The word evangelical became associated not with spreading the good news, but with excusing the inexcusable. But Trump was catalyst, not cause. He exposed fault lines that had been developing for decades. The real issue was deeper. Evangelicalism had slowly transformed from a theological movement into a tribal identity, and tribal identities can't survive internal contradiction. Consider what happened at Wheaton College, the so-called Harvard of evangelical education. In December 2015, 2016, a political science professor named Larisha Hawkins posted on Facebook that she would wear a hijab during Advent to show solidarity with Muslims. She wrote that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. The controversy that erupted didn't center on theology, it centered on tribal loyalty. Hawkins was eventually asked to leave, and the incident sent shockwaves through evangelical academia. Students and young alumni watched their flagship institution choose political and cultural conformity over theological nuance. Many of them quietly began dropping the evangelical label. Or look at what happened with Russell Moore. As head of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, Moore criticized Trump during the 2016 campaign, calling his behavior reality television moral sewage. The backlash was swift and severe. Pastors called for his firing. Churches threatened to withhold funding from Southern Baptist missions. Moore eventually resigned in 2021, saying the parts of the evangelical movement had become a political operation entirely disconnected from the gospel. Here was one of evangelicalism's most prominent leaders, a man with impeccable theological credentials, being pushed out for failing a political litmus test. The stories multiply. In 2018, a Christianity Today survey found that 44% of evangelical pastors under 45 reported feeling significant tension between their personal convictions and what their congregations expected them to say politically. Many described an unwritten rule: you could preach about personal morality, sexual ethics, and individual sin, but questioning political narratives or power structures was off limits. The pulpit had become constrained not by Scripture but by partisan expectations. Meanwhile, outside evangelical circles, the word itself was developing new connotations. Google Trends data shows a dramatic shift in what appears alongside evangelical in searches. Before 2016, common associations included beliefs, churches, and theology. After 2016, the most common associations became Trump, hypocrite, and politics. In the broader culture, evangelical stopped meaning someone who believes in sharing the gospel and started meaning right-wing political activist who happens to be Christian. This linguistic shift had real consequences. Young evangelicals doing missionary work abroad reported that identifying as evangelical created instant hostility. A 25-year-old missionary in Thailand described arriving in 2017 and quickly learning never to use the word evangelical when introducing himself. People would literally recoil, he said. They'd immediately bring up Trump or American politics or ask why I hated gay people. I had to explain that I was a different kind of Christian. Eventually, he stopped trying to reclaim the label and just started saying he followed Jesus. The word that was supposed to facilitate gospel proclamation had become an obstacle to it. The exodus intensified around 2020, driven by multiple crises. The COVID-19 pandemic became politicized, with many prominent evangelical leaders downplaying the virus or opposing public health measures. Young evangelicals watched their churches prioritize political statements about mask mandates over caring for vulnerable members. Then came the murder of George Floyd and the racial justice protests. Surveys showed that 68% of white evangelicals opposed the Black Lives Matter movement, while 80% of evangelicals under 30 believed racial inequality was a serious problem requiring action. The generational gap had become a chasm. January 6, 2021 widened it further. When rioters stormed the U.S. Capitol, many carried Christian flags and crosses alongside Confederate flags and QAnon symbols. Images of a shirtless man in horns and face paint, described as the QAnon shaman, praying in the Senate chamber went viral. Several prominent evangelical leaders initially downplayed the violence or spread conspiracy theories about Antifa infiltrators. For millions of younger evangelicals watching in horror, it was a point of no return. The movement they'd grown up in seemed to have lost its moral bearings entirely. The numbers confirm this. A 2022 survey by the Public Religion Research Institute found that among Americans under 30 who were raised evangelical, 40% no longer identify with the label. That's not 40% who left Christianity, it's 40% who specifically abandoned the evangelical identity while often maintaining faith. They're attending non-denominational churches that avoid the label, or joining mainline Protestant congregations, or creating house churches that emphasize discipleship over political engagement. Some have founded new movements explicitly designed to reclaim evangelical theology while rejecting evangelical tribalism. The Exvangelical community, primarily online, now includes hundreds of thousands of members who share stories of leaving evangelical churches while maintaining Christian faith. Popular podcasts like The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill and The Holy Post attract millions of listeners who identify as theologically conservative but culturally progressive, or at least apolitical. What's particularly striking is the class dimension of this exodus. Research from the University of Notre Dame shows that evangelicals with college degrees are abandoning the label at much higher rates than those without. In 2008, there was virtually no difference in evangelical identification based on education level. By 2020, evangelicals with bachelor's degrees were 12 percentage points less likely to use the label than those with only high school education. The evangelical identity is becoming increasingly associated with less educated, rural, older Americans, which further accelerates the exodus of younger, urban, educated believers who don't want to be associated with that stereotype. The geographic patterns are equally revealing. Evangelical identification has remained relatively stable in the Deep South and rural Midwest, but has collapsed in coastal cities and suburbs. In Portland, Oregon, the number of people identifying as evangelical dropped by 47% between 2014 and 2022. In Austin, Texas, it fell by 38%. These aren't just liberal cities where you'd expect Christianity to decline generally. These are places where actual church attendance has remained constant or even grown, but people attending churches are refusing to call themselves evangelical. Publishers have noticed. Christian bookstores report that books with evangelical in the title sell poorly to younger demographics, while books emphasizing Jesus, faith, or gospel without the evangelical label sell well. Authors who built careers as evangelical voices are rebranding. Jen Hatmaker, once a beloved evangelical author and speaker, publicly distanced herself from the term in 2016 after expressing support for LGBTQ inclusion. She lost speaking gigs and publishing contracts, but gained a massive following among post-evangelicals who appreciated her willingness to question the tribal boundaries. Churches are adapting too, often quietly. Across the country, congregations that would have proudly displayed evangelical in their names or mission statements in the 1990s and 2000s are undergoing subtle rebrands. They're becoming community churches, Bible churches, or simply church with no denominational identifier. They teach the same theology, often using the same Sunday school curriculum, but they've scrubbed the evangelical branding. When asked why, pastors give remarkably consistent answers. New visitors were making incorrect assumptions about the church based on the word evangelical, and it was creating an unnecessary barrier to ministry. This creates a fascinating paradox. By some measures, evangelicalism is thriving. Churches that embrace classic evangelical theology, emphasize personal conversion, and focus on biblical authority are growing, especially among younger demographics. Multi-site megachurches like Church of the Highlands in Alabama or Christ Fellowship in Florida are reaching thousands of young adults with thoroughly evangelical teaching. But they're growing by avoiding the evangelical label. They've kept the substance while abandoning the brand. Sociologists call this cultural unbundling. For a century, evangelical identity came as a package deal. Certain theological beliefs, certain political positions, certain cultural markers, certain aesthetic preferences. You believed in biblical inerrancy, and you probably voted Republican, and you probably listened to contemporary Christian music, and you probably homeschooled or sent kids to Christian schools. The entire bundle was the identity. What's happening now is millions of people are keeping the theological elements they value while discarding the cultural and political elements they reject. A 33-year-old engineer in Denver described it perfectly. I believe everything my parents believe about God, Jesus, the Bible, sin, and salvation, but I don't believe those theological convictions require me to have opinions about tax policy, immigration law, or critical race theory. My parents can't separate their faith from their politics. I can, and I have to, because their version of Christianity is driving my friends away from Jesus. This separation is exactly what many evangelical leaders feared and fought against. For decades, figures like James Dobson, Albert Mohler, and Franklin Graham argued that cultural and political engagement were inseparable from authentic Christian faith. To be truly evangelical, they insisted, meant opposing abortion, defending traditional marriage, and supporting conservative policies. They built institutions, seminaries, and media empires around this comprehensive vision. Now they're watching younger believers accept their theology while rejecting their politics, and they're calling it compromise or apostasy. But the young adults leaving the evangelical label don't see it as compromise. They see it as recovery. They're trying to recover a version of Christianity focused on Jesus' teachings about caring for the poor, welcoming the stranger, and loving enemies. They're trying to recover churches that prioritize spiritual formation over political mobilization. They're trying to recover a public witness that attracts people to Christ rather than repelling them with culture war rhetoric. The institutional consequences are severe. Denominations that built their identities around evangelicalism are hemorrhaging members. The Southern Baptist Convention, America's largest Protestant denomination and flagship evangelical institution, lost over 2 million members between 2006 and 2022. Some left for doctrinal reasons or because of sex abuse scandals, but exit interviews reveal many left primarily because of the association with partisan politics. They joined non-denominational or independent churches that offered similar theology without the cultural baggage. Christian colleges face even steeper challenges. Applications to explicitly evangelical colleges like Liberty University, Oral Roberts, and Bob Jones have plateaued or declined, while applications to Christian colleges that avoid evangelical branding, like Pepperdine or Seattle Pacific, have surged. High school seniors from Christian families want faith-based education, but they don't want to be identified with evangelicalism. Enrollment counselors describe this as their biggest challenge: how to communicate the school's Christian commitment without triggering the negative associations that come with the evangelical label. Missionary organizations report similar struggles. Agencies like the International Mission Board and Wycliffe Bible Translators have seen significant drops in applications from college-age candidates since 2016. Interviews with recruitment directors reveal a common pattern. Young Christians remain passionate about missions, but are uncomfortable with agencies that emphasize evangelical identity. They're joining non-denominational or progressive missions organizations instead, or creating their own grassroots projects that avoid institutional affiliation entirely. Perhaps most significantly, the financial base is eroding. Evangelical nonprofits depend on donations from committed evangelicals, but as younger generations reject the label, they're also rejecting the institutions. A 2023 analysis by the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability found that donors under 40 give 63% less to evangelical organizations than donors over 60, even when controlling for income. Young Christians are still generous. They're just directing their giving to local churches, direct relief efforts, or nonprofits that don't carry evangelical branding. Throughout all of this, a question looms: can the evangelical label be salvaged? Some leaders are trying. In 2019, a group of prominent pastors and theologians published the Statement on Social Justice and the Gospel, attempting to define true evangelicalism in explicitly theological rather than political terms. It backfired spectacularly. Critics from both left and right attacked it, and the controversy only reinforced many people's decisions to abandon the label. You can't rehabilitate a brand that's become tribally coded by issuing statements, no matter how carefully worded. Others are taking different approaches. Tim Keller, until his death in 2023, advocated for what he called third-way evangelicalism, politically engaged but not aligned with either party. Keller remained proudly evangelical while criticizing both progressive and conservative Christian extremes. He attracted enormous followings among educated urban Christians, but even many of his admirers stopped calling themselves evangelical. They appreciated his theology but couldn't overcome their aversion to the term. What's emerging instead is a post-evangelical Christianity that maintains evangelical theology while rejecting evangelical tribalism. These believers affirm biblical authority, emphasize conversion, and share their faith, but they refuse to accept the political and cultural package that came with late 20th century evangelicalism. They're creating new institutions, new churches, and new vocabularies that allow them to be theologically conservative while culturally engaged in different ways. Some observers celebrate this as a necessary correction, a return to authentic Christianity freed from political compromise. Others lament it as fragmentation and loss of a unified Christian witness. But everyone agrees on one thing: we're watching a historic realignment in American religious life, and the future remains uncertain. The evangelical identity breakdown reveals something profound about the relationship between religion and culture in modern America. Identities are fragile. They depend on maintaining coherence between what you claim to value and how you behave. When that coherence breaks, when the gap between professed principles and actual practice becomes too wide, people quietly slip away. They don't always make dramatic announcements or write manifestos. They just stop using the label, stop attending the events, stop funding the institutions. The movement continues, but the identity dissolves. For millions of Americans, that dissolution is already complete. They're figuring out what comes next, building new communities, creating new expressions of faith that feel more authentic to them. Some will return to evangelical identification if the term recovers its theological meaning. Others are gone permanently, finding new homes in mainline Protestantism, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, or independent Christianity. Still others are creating something entirely new, a post-evangelical faith that takes seriously both ancient Christian orthodoxy and contemporary cultural realities. What remains certain is that American Christianity in 2024 looks radically different from American Christianity in 2004, and the change happened largely invisible to mainstream culture. While politicians and pundits obsessed over evangelical voting patterns and culture war skirmishes, millions of believers were quietly rewriting their spiritual identities, abandoning a label that once meant everything to them. They carry the same faith, the same convictions, the same commitment to following Jesus. They just refuse to be called evangelical anymore. And that refusal, multiplied across millions of lives and thousands of congregations, represents one of the most significant religious transformations in American history. Not a transformation of belief, but a transformation of identity. Not a crisis of faith, but a crisis of branding. The theology endures. The label is dying. And in the gap between those two realities, American Christianity is being remade. Thank you for watching Professor Archive. If this deep dive resonated with you, that super thanks button helps us continue this research. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, keep digging into the stories that matter.